Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Politics of You and Me, a podcast that acknowledges that everything is connected, that politics is ingrained in every single aspect of our lives, from gender-based violence to human rights, from environmental injustice to access to education. Every issue and social phenomenon shapes the way we live, work, and choose to exist. I'm your host, Mpho Nyamate, an intersectional activist and writer working relentlessly to unpack lived realities and amplify voices often left unheard. As always, I'm bringing you bold conversations and real solutions. Thank you for joining me as we relaunch the podcast and transition into a new season, Season 2. In line with the commemoration of Women's Day, exactly 70 years since the Women's March against the past laws, and the 30th anniversary of the Constitution, our conversations will be guided by the Constitution of South Africa, 1996. In line with today's topic, our conversations will also be guided by the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in accordance with Afghanistan's Development Report from 2023. Here, we generate impact through dialogue. Today's topic is centered on gender apartheid in Afghanistan. The de facto rule of Taliban in Afghanistan is defined by and has become synonymous with the relentless efforts to silence and erase women and girl children from the face of the world. As our Afghan sisters are denied freedom of movement without a male chaperone, the opportunity to work, access to healthcare, access to education, and the very right to exist, we are reminded of the dangers of systems, institutions, and more specifically, regimes that thrive on discriminatory laws against women. We are reminded of the dangers of leaving our fellow sisters behind. As such, this episode is not just a discussion of the interconnected struggles that we face as women, although that is a very important key component to this discussion. But more importantly, it is actually a call to mobilize solidarity for our Afghan sisters experiencing oppression, violence, and discrimination in Afghanistan. It is a call for resolutions that promptly protect and uplift women actively fighting from behind the bars of erasure. As the world watches when Afghan women get their rights taken overnight, this is a plea to our world leaders, government officials, the international community, and most importantly, our listeners, to boldly, proudly, judiciously speak up for women burdened by laws that prohibit them from even speaking too loud. We are joined today by our esteemed speakers, distinguished guests, sisters in solidarity. As an extension of the recent Legacy and Solidarity Roundtable hosted at Constitutional Hill by We the People South Africa in collaboration with the Malala Fund, I am joined today by the delegation of Afghanistan, specifically two very special women who are representing Jobs Afghanistan and the Education Bridge in Afghanistan. And so, we have transitioned to the first part of our discussion, women's struggles during and after apartheid. The Taliban's institutionalized gender-based discrimination shares similar characteristics to South Africa's racial apartheid, and more specifically, the treatment of Black women or non-white individuals at the time. And as we work towards the elimination of gender apartheid in Afghanistan, it is important to speak on the history of South Africa's apartheid era and highlight women's role in dismantling the segregation. So apartheid is tragically known for institutionalizing the separation of white and non-white groups and individuals. It actually stands for separateness in Afrikaans. Now, during South Africa's racially segregated, oppressive apartheid era, groups falling under the non-white category, that being Black, colored, and Indian people, were regarded as second-class citizens and found themselves excluded from the right to vote, travel freely, get quality education, own land, accumulate wealth independently. The list goes on. And in the words of Thuli Mpambukeli, in her journal titled Apartheid, the basic rights afforded to black and colored individuals ultimately defined the political landscape of South Africa. And so racism was institutionalized through the following forms of legislation. We had the Bantu Education Act, which was conceived by its architect, Hendrik F. Verwoerd, as it being in existence since there is no place for the African in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. In his words, he believed that it is no avail for Africans to receive training which has as its aim absorption in the European community. And so this conditioned Africans, non-whites, to accept an inferior status. In the words of Mam Joyce Seroke, who was also imprisoned at Constitutional Hill, she told us about how important it is to speak on these issues because back then they believed in educating the boy child instead, even though that education would directly translate to still receiving education that is really not on the level of being an entrepreneur, more on the level of being a worker. We also had the 1913 Land Act, where women could not own land in rural areas, and it was very difficult to get ownership to land without the permission of a man, infringing on the right to identify beyond the family structure. And in the case of sexual violence, acts such as rape were misconstrued and defined as force within black township spaces. This prevented access to justice. We also had the Group Areas Act of 1950. This displaced hundreds of thousands of people in order to eliminate mixed neighborhoods in the face of white supremacy. This institutionalized segregation. That being, it left off the urban areas to the exclusive access of white individuals while also making sure that these regions were able to get uninterrupted access to water and sanitation management. While on the other side of the coin, non-white groups struggled to access these basic rights with ease. Apartheid was also institutionalized through the pass laws, which meant that a passbook had to be carried between government-determined homelands of the city. This document, otherwise known as a dompas, would have details on where you stay, where you're allowed to work. And if you lost it, the penalty would be being arrested and then going to jail. And so exactly 70 years ago, on the 9th of August 1956, 20,000 women marched to the Union buildings in Pretoria with a petition containing more than 100,000 signatures against the country's pass laws. This was how they protested against the lack of freedom of movement. Members of the Federation of South African Women came together, and this is how the phrase "Watinti umfazi, watinti mbogodo," you strike a woman, you strike a rock, that is how that phrase was born. And the beautiful thing about women is they not only fight for themselves, but they also fight for their counterparts. Yes, they were fighting for freedom of movement, but they also fought for their husbands, who they often needed to bail out of jail in instances where they forgot their passbooks, or dompas as we call it. And so even after all of those efforts, the women who protested against the apartheid government, your Mam Winnie Madikizela Mandela, your Mam Joyce Seroke, Mam Albertina Sizulu, and Mam Dorothy Nyembe, they were imprisoned under very terrible conditions. And having visited the women's prison at Constitutional Hill, and I'm sure my guests would also agree since they were also able to visit that monument, and also being able to get reflections from Mam Joyce Seroke, both of these instances highlighted just how terrible the conditions were in the jails. Upon entry, women were asked to remove their underwear. When they were menstruating, they were asked to show the correction officer their blood, evidence that they are going through a personal biological process. Upon proving that they were menstruating, they had to use a reusable cloth to trap the blood and manage their menstruation. Oftentimes, it was on such a thin shoestring that it would always fall. And when it did fall, they were threatened with force. The prisoners had to shower in an open space. Only the open space had a big view where they could be viewed from up on high by people in buildings. And so showering became a humiliation ritual. And their cells where they used to sleep were small and had very little space. This is where we see that regimes standing against women thrive on stripping women from their dignity. It shows how deep the struggle of black women at the time was. And it shows the intersecting struggle between race and gender. And so when prisoners were released, the CODESA talks commenced. This is the Convention for Democratic South Africa, otherwise known as negotiations to end apartheid in South Africa. Women were told to wait until the racial struggle disappeared, even though they risked their lives during apartheid. So, during the first conference in 1990, after the ANC had been banned, the ANC Women's League were against the notion of waiting and called for at least a 30% representation of women in the CODESA delegation. And the ANC Women's League worked alongside the Federation of South African Women to unite and protest the exclusion of women. They demanded for parties of CODESA to have women. They demanded that there was seats vacant for women, and they demanded that there was at least one woman president. Now, at the Women's National Coalition, an avenue to mobilize for action during negotiation period in 1991, a plan was established to have a women's charter. And this is how women went around the country gathering concerns of women from all walks of life. This included, more importantly, having gender equality in the Constitution. And these concerns were incorporated in the new Constitution and the Bill of Rights, setting the constitutional foundation for South Africa being a non-sexist society. In the words of Me Winnie Madikizela Mandela, nothing about us without us. This led to the birth of Section 1, subsection B of the founding provisions of the Constitution, which stipulated that South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the values of non-racialism and non-sexism. Section 27, subsection 1A of the Bill of Rights was also born. And this stipulated that everyone has the right to have access to health, including reproductive health care. We also had the birth of Section 187 of the Functions for the Commission of Gender Equality, which stipulates that the Commission must promote respect for gender equality and the protection, development, and attainment of gender equality with the power, as guided by national legislation, to perform these functions. And even though we won, there is still so much to be done. Just last year, Women for Change worked very hard to bring gender-based violence and femicide to light. Founded by Sabrina Walter, Women for Change organized a demonstration at the Union Building calling for government action on gender-based violence and femicide. This took the form of a memorandum, or rather a petition, with 1 million signatures by the public. And when they saw that there wasn't any realistic, progressive government action, then last year, as world leaders were gathering for G20, Women for Change organized a G20 Women's Shutdown. And that was the birth of the Purple Movement. Purple profile pictures around the world, signifying a digital act of solidarity for women experiencing violence. It had a 1 billion organic digital reach on socials. And this is what led to gender-based violence and femicide being declared a national disaster. However, the struggle still lives on, because gender-based violence has been declared a national disaster without any plans or action to end femicide. To this day, 15 women are murdered every day. So, there's much to be done in South Africa, and much to be done for women who are still witnessing what South African women witnessed in apartheid. Our women's liberation movement in South Africa is exactly 70 years old today. But around the world, particularly in Afghanistan, Women are denied education, and in the instances that they get education, it usually comes at the cost of being conditioned to feel inferior. The law does not protect women from domestic violence at all. We could even argue that it sometimes encourages it. And so, in times of instability, violence, human rights violations, the people most vulnerable to oppression are women. We've seen this play out in Sudan, Congo, Palestine, and now Afghanistan. And so, on this Women's Day, I encourage us to remember that we, as women, are not free if we have not witnessed the liberation, autonomy of women across the world. We are not free until they are too. And so, for the second part of our discussion, I will be opening up the floor to our two speakers. The topic at hand is how Afghan women are experiencing gender apartheid and the work that is being done on the ground. And so I'm going to ask our speakers to each take a moment to introduce themselves, their organization of choice, the work being done, and how Afghan women are experiencing gender apartheid. I will start with Miss Miriam Safi.
Thank you very much for having me here with you. It's an incredibly timely conversation. It's an important conversation. And before I begin, I'd like to wish all of your listeners a very happy Women's Day. 70 years, it's quite remarkable. And you mentioned all the difficulties that South Africa still has, the challenges it still has to tackle. But also in these 70 years, a lot of progress has also been made. And we've seen some of that progress in the last couple of days. So with us and our work in Afghanistan, I founded a think tank in 2014. The acronym is DROPS, and it stands for the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies. When I created DROPS, it was for one particular objective, and that was to bridge the gap between evidence-based research and policymaking. Because that was missing in Afghanistan during the Republic, before the fall. We wanted to make sure that when decision makers made their policies and their strategies, that it was found on the voices of the Afghan people. The Afghan people should determine what it is that their communities need, what is working for them, what is not working for them, whether that's politically, security-wise, or speaking in terms of economics and development. Then after the fall of the Republic, the return of the Taliban regime, we pivoted a little bit. And while we continue our evidence-based research, our policy training, and our policy advocacy, which are three of our core pillars, we now specifically are part of lead two particular initiatives. One, we have this initiative called Bishnau, which means listen in Dari, in our local language. And what this does is we survey Afghan women every 3 months in the thousands on key issues that are affecting them at that moment in time. You see, the Taliban, every 2 months or 3 months, they come up with a new edict, a new law, a new restriction. So we have to capture how that is impacting women and girls. And what are the spaces still available to us to be able to help them navigate those restrictions? So in the process of Bishnau, in the last few years, we have surveyed over 75,000 women. And in these surveys, the data that we collect, we act as a bridge to make sure this data gets to the UN in New York, in Geneva, the European Parliament, key capitals like here in South Africa. We have to show policymakers that the stories they're hearing about the atrocities women face, it's backed up by evidence. And evidence and data is incredibly important when you want to make a solid case for what's happening. And then on part of, next to this initiative, we were also a part of 3 organizations last year, Afghan organizations, that held the very first People's Tribunal for the prosecution of women in Afghanistan. And this tribunal, for one, it was very first time in history that Afghan civil society organizations held a tribunal. And it was the first time it was held on the gender persecution of women. And this tribunal was held because international accountability mechanisms were failing us. So we took matters into our own hands and we organized this. And when the testimonies of the survivors, who were predominantly the female protesters that were taken by the Taliban, tortured, and then with the help of INGOs and Afghan organizations brought out of the country, we were able to basically develop and build a strong case to show that what is happening in Afghanistan is in fact gender persecution. We had a panel of 7 judges. One of our judges was Dr. Rashida Munjo, who is South African, and who was at the University of Cape Town. And she was the presiding judge who announced the judgment, which was then held at The Hague last year. And in that, Dr. Munjo said that it is indeed gender persecution in Afghanistan, one. And second of all, that the evidence and the testimonies that were presented to them by the prosecution team shows that it could also amount to gender apartheid under the Rome Statute when and if gender apartheid is codified. It could also be presented as a strong case there. So, all in all, DROPS works predominantly with the objective of making sure local voices are heard, particularly women and girls, in all those international platforms. And that we make sure that accountability is pursued to the best of its ability. And if that means the international community can't do it, we as Afghans do it.
Thank you so much for those very insightful reflections. It's very important to have work that is centered on local voices, local realities. Otherwise, the atrocities that happen on the ground, the inequalities that happen on the ground, get, if I can say, lost in all the policy discussions, and we don't want policymakers to be making big decisions without understanding what's going on the ground. So thank you for that. And then our next speaker, may I kindly give the floor to Dr. Jafari.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to congratulate you and Women of South Africa on 70th anniversary of Women's March on the Women's Day. It's very inspiring what have been achieved by women in South Africa. I am a medical physicist, clinical scientist, and I wear 3 hats. So I work in the hospital as clinical scientist. I'm an entrepreneur, commercializing my research outcome, which is commercialization of radiation detectors, to checking the quality of treatment for cancer patients. But what is closer to my heart at this situation is education of girls in Afghanistan. That's why I am chairperson and founder of the charity called Education Bridge for Afghanistan. The Education Bridge for Afghanistan was born in response to the abundance of girls from schools and universities when a group of diaspora came together and asking ourselves what can be done in this situation. So we have done a couple of weeks of studies on understanding the situation, what is going on, and we observed many educational activists running different aspects of education for the girls in the secret schools, underground, unofficial settings, and some of the girls themselves initiated group studies in their houses. But it was none of them were following a certain standard, and none of these activities were leading to a qualification that girls could continue their education further. So we saw this as a big gap. Another thing we spotted was mentality of society towards alternative education. So the mentality was still on education is just in the classroom with the teacher, in person. So we started looking into how we can shift society's mentality by introducing new methods and means of education. And as an example, we created an online school. We gathered on the first year all the recorded lessons and the ones that were missing. It was one of the things that COVID gifted actually to the society, was a lot of online lessons recorded. So consortium of schools in Kabul donated their recorded lessons, and there was about 70% of year 7 to year 12 lessons, but there was about 30% missing. So we started making the teams of teachers, started recording to completing the lessons, and also thinking how to hold the exams and all the aspects of online delivery to certain standard, which was completely new to the society. So for the first year, we focused on all the infrastructure needed and the mentality shift of the society. Second year, in August 2022, we started our online school. We piloted with 100 students, and very quickly we realized the need of teachers and students about digital literacy. Not many students were familiar with Google Classrooms, for example, or other means of classrooms and the platforms they needed to use. So very quickly we started to form lessons for the teachers first, and then students, how to use online platforms. And second year, 400 students were enrolled after we had the 3 months of digital literacy training, and it started going really well. So we now focused on accreditation process. That was the missing part. I knocked every examination board door in UK, and also the examination boards that I could get hold of them internationally. Lots of promises, but nothing in practice for 2 years. Eventually in 2024, one of the examination board in the UK called the Learning Machine, whose focus was mostly on art, music, and vocational training, they came to me and said, we can help you. And then we brought our expertise, their expertise together, and created curriculum that covered scientific topics as well, like physics, biology, chemistry, mathematics, professional communication skills, geography, history, psychology. All the topics that we taught are really important for our students to educate them, but also open the door to various subjects at the universities. And by 2025, we had approval from OFQOL, which is the Office for Standardization of Education Matters, that we received the approval for the subjects that we applied. And we started registering students for accreditation process. And that's where Malala Fund stepped in. Before Malala, we applied to many organizations like UNICEF, for example. We didn't hear back. But Malala Fund trusted us, and they were the first organization that financially supported, and with the a small project that we had with Malala Fund. We stretched that money so thinly that we created the whole learning management system. We developed all the lessons required for the students in terms of the higher level, because we already had lessons from year 7 to 12. But when it comes to UK standard, we need additional lessons to catch up with the standard level, but also the education system in UK required pre-university as well, which one of the famous qualification is A-level, you probably heard, which is level 3 of Ofqual standard. So we developed level 2 and level 3 curriculum, the lessons, the study guides, and started enrolling students. In our project, we were getting ready for 2,000 students. But as soon as we put the registration form out, within 2 weeks, we received 12,000 registrations. And we started doing the assessment process, and continuously students were signing up. Now we have 48,000 students on the system, 32,000 actively taking exams, and the rest is waiting for their semester to start. The first cohort of students are graduating, and we are talking to internal and also international universities to accept our students directly without requiring the government of Afghanistan approval, because some of the universities have this process of your qualification should go through this specific route. But with the negotiations and discussions we have with these universities, now we do have many of the universities understanding the situation and also understanding the highest standard of education that we are implementing, and happy to accept our students.
Thank you so much for that insightful breakdown of what you do, how you've been doing it, and the students that you've been getting on board. It's so important to be taking such a resilient approach to making sure that our young people, our young women get educated. And what I hear from you both is a really beautiful pillar of leadership, if I may, that, a great leader is one who is very intelligent to the context, having contextual intelligence and being able to make decisions and acquire data and create opportunities in accordance to the context, in accordance with the demands that are needed on the ground. So I just want to thank you both for being amazing leaders, for leading very important programs that are shaping lives and really amplifying voices that are often left unheard. And now we are transitioning to our third discussion, which is going to be in group format. We're just going to be having a general discussion about how the institutionalized oppression and discrimination of women in Afghanistan, how that contravenes with international and humanitarian law. So I'm going to open up the floor to any one of the speakers, and we can start the conversation there.
So I'll start off by just reiterating that Afghanistan as a state is a signatory to several conventions, including CEDAW, which we are a part of, all 9 components of CEDAW, without changing a word. We were one of those states that we did not change anything in CEDAW when we adopted it and signed on to it. Same thing with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, child rights, for example. So, Afghanistan as a state, during the 20 years of the Republic, starting in 2001 till 2021, we were really among those states that without question supported and ratified and adopted anything in international law that protected women's rights, human rights. Now, when governments collapse or they're taken over and they're changed, the state is still obligated to uphold those conventions. It's still obligated to its international commitments. So the Taliban do not have the right to not uphold those. They decided to not. That's why they're not recognized. They are not a government. They're called the de facto authorities. And they're called the de facto authorities because the UN gave them that label. To us, they are a apartheid regime. That's what they are. They're no de facto authorities for us. They're certainly not a government. They were not elected. They don't represent the people. They have an emir that is a self-proclaimed emir. He proclaimed himself the leader of the Taliban. He was the leader of the Taliban, elected by a council of religious scholars. And then when they took over Afghanistan, he's the emir, and they all have to abide by him. So right now, I just wanted to paint that picture so you understand that A, they are not a government, and B, because they are not upholding the state's obligations, they are not recognized by the international community as a legitimate government. So that's one thing. In terms of your questions of what is happening in terms of international accountability, if I've understood correctly.
Yes.
So for right now, the avenues that Afghan civil society actors and others in the international community have used include cases under the ICJ, so under CEDAW, the ICC. So those are two avenues in particular. So the ICC did announce arrest warrants last year for Taliban, for certain specific Taliban officials, and they are pursuing that avenue. Then under the ICJ, we have a case that was taken upon by 4 nations, Canada, Germany, Australia. Now, the ICJ, this case, when it was picked up, we're really happy about it. However, it's stalled now. So it's stalled, it's not moving forward, and it's stalled because Germany, which is leading it, is just using it as political leverage in its dialogue with the Taliban to help facilitate the deportation of Afghans that it does not, it has decided to not give asylum to. To be able to deport Afghans back to Afghanistan, they need some sort of, state engine of sorts. So they need basically the Taliban's cooperation. So they gave the Taliban the Afghan consulate in Bonn. In the sense, when I say give, they invited their diplomats, allowed them to come into to Germany and stay there to help facilitate this through the consulate. Now, is it so funny that on the one hand, you're leading an ICJ case, right, on Afghanistan and what the Taliban are doing to women and girls, and then on the other hand, you invite those same individuals and you give them the consulate and you hold dialogue with them. The European Union invited the Taliban to Geneva just a couple months ago, for example. There was huge protests within some parliamentarians, huge, and within the European Parliament, but they were outnumbered. They came anyways. So why migration? They want to deport. So you see, these other priorities always take over. Same thing with the ICC cases. They're there, arrest warrants have been announced, but now it's stalling. And these processes are very long term. They take a long, long time. That's why we convened the People's Tribunal for the women of Afghanistan. These two scenarios, they will take anywhere from 10 to 15 years. It's a very long time. The women of Afghanistan can't wait that long. They cannot wait that long. We mark 5 years this August 15th. It's the fifth. It's not an anniversary for me. It's the fifth, most dreadful year of the Taliban's gender apartheid regime. And in these 5 years, so much has happened. They have basically announced they have announced over 200 edicts, 154 of them target women. They just passed a penal code a couple of months ago that now entrenches gender inequality. Women are not equal. In fact, the penal code refers to women not as secondary citizens, as slaves. The term slave is within that penal code. So women not having the right to education beyond grade 6 was something they announced when they came early on. They returned to Afghanistan. After that, women could not go to higher education, so universities, all that stopped. Then it was women cannot work anywhere except for the health sector and teachers. But then you don't need teachers really because primary schooling, very few were sending their children, and then you had a ban anyways. And for health sector, last year they announced that midwifery programs, nursing programs, all of those, women can't go to them either. So those are all shut as well. Women cannot leave their house without a male guardian. Of course, women have to wear, a full hijab, but it's not a full hijab. It's their version of what a hijab should be. Afghanistan is an Islamic country. In Afghanistan, women and girls dress modestly, and they had a scarf. But now they need to wear a black abaya, black gloves, a black face covering, sunglasses, and then they may leave their home, that too with a male guardian. So this is what the scenario is like right now. And under the penal code, women do not have any rights. Like I said, they're considered slaves. They're not even, because it says slaves and it says masters. Their husbands are masters. So they have no rights, no property rights. During apartheid, women here, with the past laws that you mentioned, right? You said that apartheid was the segregation. In Afghanistan, what's happening is women are segregated from everybody, including other women, because they can't leave the confines of their home. Even if they're standing in a kitchen and there's a window that needs to be painted black or covered, no one should be able to look inside. And with the past laws that you guys had here during apartheid, which said where women could go, where they couldn't go, we have in Afghanistan those women who work at the, let's say they're a doctor, and if they're allowed to go to work, they have to go to the Taliban offices and get a pass, basically. They get a pass. So they use that pass when they have to go to work, because when Taliban stops them in checkpoints, they have to show that pass to show where I'm going and that it's legitimate where I'm going. So they have to have a pass. Only those few who are able to work in maybe in the health sector. So there's a lot of parallels. That's why we call it gender apartheid. The women of Afghanistan call it gender apartheid. We did a survey of thousands of women. 70% said we want the UN to call it gender apartheid. And gender apartheid is right now being discussed at the 6th Committee of the United Nations. And several nations have joined that discussion and are supporting it, but it's very few. It's just 7. We need dozens and dozens of more states for that to be considered seriously. And the next hearing or the next opening of this dialogue will be next year, April of 2027. So we have a year to mobilize as much support as we could. And one of the reasons why we're here is because South Africa's support and that committee could change the landscape for us. Many states who are not joining it is because they're looking at South Africa, because South Africa is sitting on the fence. Because of the issues of definition and the context of apartheid and gender apartheid, because of those matters, they're hesitant to join. So they're looking at South Africa. If South Africa comes on board, I'm sure we will reach the 135 votes or member states we need for this to move forward.
Thank you so much for that breakdown. I think it's really important as well to, get into the specificities and really understand the human rights violations, as well as how the Taliban are regarded, not as a formal actor, not as a state actor, but a group that is not even voted in, and a group that really has infringed on human rights and everything within that scope. So I just want to thank you for that. And I think in terms of my own understanding in relation to what you've just said, I think about the convention in terms of the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and what really stuck out to me was some of the articles, talking about, for example, Article 7, women in Afghanistan not really having access to vote, and the Taliban being in power, and it being a group that wasn't even called into power by the people, as well as women not be allowed to hold public offices, not be allowed to form part of NGOs. We look at these articles within the conventions, and we really see a lot of the things that women are denied, but also we look at it also knowing that the Taliban is indeed not an official actor, an official speaker of the people. So I just really want to thank you for your insights. Is there any other contributions or thoughts on your side, directing us to our other speaker?
Well, as Mariam John was explaining the breakdown of situation, what was marching in my head was what other solutions are possible on the ground. And I think what we can do is making systems at the international level in terms of education system, medical system, financial system. So when the system is at the international level, when there is a collapse of a government, the effect is not as big as it is now. Giving example of education, we now teamed up with UK examination board. So when the education standards and the content and the assessment and issuance of a certificate and diploma is done via an international organization, with the current technologies around the world, a little bit of it in Afghanistan, we can build the infrastructure required for an international level educational system. We can take a school to every home when girls cannot go from home to school. And then suddenly you have made the disruption required, and Taliban cannot take education right as a hostage. That's what I believe it is. It's just hostage because I know the commanders of Taliban's girls are at the schools. A lot of them are outside in Gulf countries and furthering their education. So if they truly believe that education is bad for girls, why it's not bad for their own girls? And another thing is keeping the society ignorant so they obey their rules. That's why When they close the schools, on other hand, they use those infrastructure to start madrasas. And Mariam has a good statistics on explaining how many madrasas and jihadi madrasas, and the aim of these type of education is. If I hand over to you, Mariam.
Yeah, when the Taliban took over and immediately closed secondary schools for girls, they didn't just leave those schools idle. They didn't turn them into boys' schools. They closed them and they turned them into religious seminaries. See, madrasas, religious schools, are a part of Islamic countries. They have always been a part of Islamic countries. They were there in Afghanistan forever. What's different now is that the madrasa curriculum has changed. And the madrasa curriculum basically espouses Taliban ideology. Now, the Taliban are no freedom fighters. Okay? I find sometimes here in South Africa, among some groups, that there's a misconception that they fought imperialists and that they were freedom fighters because they fought the Soviets and then afterwards they fought the Americans. It's not so black and white. There's many shades here. They were a part of the Mujahideen when we were fighting the communists. That's true. Not all of them, some of the figures. But ultimately, the Taliban grew out of Deobandi, very strict institutions that have very strict interpretations of Islam that were based in Pakistan. And they grew up there, and they studied there. And the Taliban basically, as an institution, got the support they needed and all of that from Pakistan when they started their insurgency in Afghanistan in 2001. The history of the Taliban is very important to know. So initially they were a part of the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets. And then after the Soviets in Afghanistan, there was a civil war. There was the political parties basically, they killed millions of Afghans, these political parties. Because when the Soviets fell, the country was just sort of laid out. And so they all had to fight for power. They couldn't come together. And they killed a lot of civilians. And the atrocities that the political parties, who were the Mujahideen, had committed against Afghans was what actually gave rise to the Taliban in many ways too. These Mujahideen parties slaughtered people, raped women, abducted women from their homes, if they wanted them for marriage or any other reason, and those families said no, they'll just pick them up. And it was a bunch of families in southern Afghanistan, in a province called Kandahar, who approached a local mullah. His name was Mullah Omar, the first emir of the Taliban. These Mujahideen leaders, these Mujahideen commanders, they are wreaking havoc. They're abducting our girls. So he came together with a bunch of other mullahs, other religious clerics, and they went after those commanders. They picked them up, they hanged them. This is the truth of what had happened. They got a lot of support from the people. Now finally, maybe these people will save us from the atrocities that these so-called freedom fighters are doing. The Taliban too, some of their members were a part of that. And some were communists, by the way. And then they grew in strength. And around 1994, they started marching towards Kabul, the capital. And they came and they kind of swept into Kabul, and they were able to take over the capital from the warring Mujahideen parties. And they were able to get rid of some, others fled, and they took over Kabul. And from 1996 till 2001, they ruled. Now, what's interesting here is that the group that initially got some support for helping their local communities eventually became a menace to society. Because when they took over, what did they do? In 1996, they closed girls' schools. Girls cannot go to school, they cannot work, men had to wear a particular type of outfit, they had to leave long beards, and they were unable to build the infrastructure that was destroyed during the Civil War. They taxed people. I mean, the level of poverty in Afghanistan at that time was atrocious. And the people realized, no, these guys are not who we thought they were.
Also, worth mentioning the support they received from international community.
Yeah, they did. And because after the Americans were done getting rid of the Soviets, they packed their bags and they left. They just left the country. And all of this then took over. So they're not freedom fighters. There was a moment in time when local communities in the South, because of what was happening by the warring Mujahideen parties, did support them. That's how he became. That's how it kind of evolved in many ways as well. And then in 2001, when the Americans came to topple them, because they were harboring Osama bin Laden. And they didn't realize that consequence, what the consequences of that would be. And when they left, they went back to, most of them went to Pakistan. And in Pakistan, they were kept, they're protected, they were given shelter, and they were given everything they needed to now turn themselves into an insurgency. The international community made a huge mistake in 2001. In 2001, the interim administration led by Hamid Karzai approached the Americans and said, listen, the Taliban are weak, you've killed many, they're dispersed, they've got nothing left, and they are coming to me and they're telling me, just let us go back to our villages and we're fine. Just let us go back. And the Americans said, no, if we catch you, you're going to either Guantanamo or you're going to Bagram. So Hamid Karzai, the president, basically told the Taliban, listen, I can't protect you. So the Taliban, like headless chickens, scrambling everywhere, went to Pakistan. 3 years later, they came back as an insurgency. And in 2006, they were as strong as ever and in full force. By 2009, Afghanistan was in turmoil with the number of insurgent attacks, suicide attacks, you name it, improvised explosive devices, and all of that. And Afghanistan fell into an insurgency. We didn't have 20 years of peace during the Republic. We didn't. The international community was trying to do state building while they were doing counterterrorism at the same time. You can't build a state on quicksand. Because the Taliban, they're doing counterinsurgency against the Taliban to get rid of them. And the Taliban were they couldn't get rid of them. And the Taliban were attacking civilians, attacking institutions, attacking infrastructure.
Schools,
clinics. Schools. Yes. They would put poison in the water in the schools. That's what they did. They would put poison in the water of the schools. They would shoot electric grids. So for days and weeks, months, we didn't have electricity in the country. Electricity was shared. I was in Afghanistan I was in Kabul when some of the most atrocious attacks by the Taliban took place. And they used to leave craters on the ground you couldn't imagine. Hundreds would die. So that's what they did for 20 years. And because the international community, in their very flawed counterinsurgency efforts, their very flawed nation building, state building initiatives, basically set the stage for their comeback upon their withdrawal. All the accomplishments in the 20 years were on the surface. We as civil society tried to root them, but corruption, nepotism, the interference of the international community in the affairs of the state in levels you cannot imagine. All of those basically led to a situation where the people were very far from the government. They didn't trust the government anymore. They didn't even trust civil society anymore. And obviously they didn't trust the international community. It created a viable space for the Taliban to recruit more young men, more and more. Not only the Taliban, but in Afghanistan we had 22 regional and international terrorist organizations operating. 22. The Taliban were one of them. So it just set the stage for the Taliban to then come. But the Taliban have been committing atrocious crimes against the people, specifically women and girls, since 1994.
And then the biggest mistake of international community, holding a peace deal in Doha.
Yes. Because they needed to secure the withdrawal of their soldiers. They needed to create peaceful pathways that they could exit from. That's why they sat with the Taliban. Zalmay Khalilzad, the representative from the United States, sat down with the Taliban during talks and basically carved out an agreement that only had, I think it had 4 parts, only 1 part was made public. Till date, the other 3 parts are not public, so we don't know what was agreed. And they set a timeline. They said, we're going to leave at this time. So until then, do not attack our soldiers. Do not block our roads and our pathways. And we're going to go. And the rest is up to all of you. So imagine the Americans holding a dialogue, a peace dialogue with the Taliban to secure their exit without the Afghan government and the Afghan people. We were not a part of it. And then once their agreement was signed, then they enticed the Taliban to sit with the Afghan government to have formal peace talks with the Afghan government. And then the Afghan government had their own negotiation team, and then talks between the two took place. But that entire peace process started in September of 2020 and ended December of 2020. That's right. That's how long. And the Taliban already got what they wanted. They always used to say this phrase, you have the watch, but we have the time. Because once they got their end date of when the international community was leaving, they just had to wait them out. They just had to wait them out. Because they knew the Afghan government could not sustain itself. Our national security forces were weak. Because, listen, you can't build an Afghan national security force in 20 years. And even then, it wasn't like we started building it in the whole of 20 years. You can't build an army, police, intelligence in like 10, 15 years. It's not possible. It's not fair to expect Afghanistan to have done that. So they were weak.
And also, since they signed the peace deal, there was this gradual process of handing over the country to Taliban supporters. Like in the military bases, the generals were getting swapped with the people who supported Taliban. Because my brother was in the army, my husband's brother was in the army, and they could see the change that was coming. And they could see the number of Taliban supporters are increasing amongst the army as well.
Wow, I think it's also very heartbreaking to hear how lack of support from the international community, a lack of initiative, has been a driver for how bad things have gotten, has been a driver for the violations and the infringements that we see happening in the lives of Afghan women. It's very disheartening. And I think on that note, I'm going to lead us to the next section of our discussion, which is a call for solidarity. I would like to hear your inputs on why is it so important to mobilize for Afghan women. I know we've addressed it in part, but I think with the conversations that we've had, anything that you might want to reiterate as part of this discussion would be so appreciated.
I give an example in medical field. When a person gets cancer, initially it's a small tumor somewhere. If the other organs in the body says, I'm fine, it's in the kidney, for example, or it's just in the lung, but hands is fine, brain is fine. Very quickly, that little tumor starts spreading everywhere. When it reaches in other organs, you can't treat that patient anymore. It's too late. Taliban is like cancer in Afghanistan. If international community don't treat it now, with the number of terrorist groups that Mariam mentioned operating in Afghanistan, later it will be threat to whole world. That's from my point of view why it is important that the whole world come together and stay in a solidarity with people of Afghanistan. What do you have to add on, Mariam?
I agree with you 100%. That's why it makes it so hard sometimes to think of solutions, cures. We can treat the symptoms.
Yeah.
But sometimes it becomes impossible to think of a cure. But I would say if several things happen simultaneously, I have lost all hope in the concept of international community. It is not a community. They are not on the same page. They are in fact more divided now than they have ever been on so many different issues. We saw in Palestine.
Yes.
Look at the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah.
They couldn't call it what it was.
No, they couldn't.
I mean, really? A community?
And we're watching it from our screens.
Exactly. It's not a community. This community also kind of has a sort of cancer. I think it still has a cure, but if untreated for too long, I don't know if we can cure it. We are in a world where democracies are in a rapid decline and autocracies are on the rise. First time in history, if you look at the figures, democracies are declining. Authoritarian regimes are up there. And then you see the populist movements all across Europe. Look at the United States. So we are at a critical time where we're facing one of the most severe moments of backlash against women's rights globally. And Afghanistan stands out amongst this because it is the only place girls cannot go to school after grade 6. Forget about all the other restrictions and atrocities and injustices. Let's just point to this one aspect, education after grade 6. So where I believe we can make a difference is two ways. One, and this is the reason why we're here in South Africa, is we came to South Africa, and we've come to South Africa a couple times now. And every time we come, we learn something new. We learn about something new that was done in the defeat of apartheid. And you won't believe it, those lessons still apply to date. You know, some people might think, well, those lessons were such a long time ago. No, they apply. They really do. So we're constantly learning, particularly the most innovative and creative ways in which South Africans use law and international law is remarkable. Really. So we learn a lot on how you use international law, how you use bilateral relations, how you conjured up international support as well. That was important. So we need to build solidarity with countries. Now, specifically, one by one, and one on one. I don't believe, and I don't have faith in the international community anymore. So when you have South Africa on your side, both its policymakers, but also its activists, what you will start seeing, and when I say you, I'm talking about Afghan people, what Afghan people will start seeing. When we had the ICJ case move forward in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, South Africa was a key member in that entire negotiation and in that process. South Africa was really important. So we now come to South Africa and we're saying, it stalled. The members the 4 countries that are part of that process, some of those members are taking advantage and using it for political leverage. So South Africa can make noise in Geneva. Absolutely. Second, when we come and we meet with the different departments, whether in the government or outside of the government that works on human rights issues, like for instance, we met the Lawyers for Human Rights, for instance, the amazing work that they do, and the Gender Apartheid Working Group, and even the South African Commission for Human Rights as well, and all the work. You know, they gave us such great ideas on how, in which other countries in Africa we should go to, that who also would be vital in helping us move some of these legal cases forward, right? So we learned that when we came here. So that's one aspect. And then at the UN, there's a lot that South Africa can do. So far, I haven't seen the South African mission as active as I had hoped. I'm hoping now that will change. I know that there is a lot of red tape within the UN system, but I believe that South Africa, with its leverage, its good relations with so many different states, especially Islamic countries, can help start building bridges, holding dialogue, whether it's at UNGA, whether it's at WPS Week coming up in October, whether it's CSW in March. It's really important that they keep their doors open to Afghan women organizations who need missions to provide spaces so they can bring up these key issues to a whole table of state members. So I'm hoping to see if South Africa really does that, and then on the 6th committee, if maybe we can make some progress on discussions around gender apartheid and the definitions. I think we'll see some good movement there. Third component, going back to what Dr. Jeffrey mentioned, I think that a movement has to start from within Afghanistan. Whether that's a movement between men and women or a movement of women. And you know, we learned from South Africa that these are processes. Nothing happens overnight. Okay. The struggle is long. It's long. We have to do it. So if we can start a movement and within Afghanistan that can start with, for example, what Dr. Jeffrey does, in my opinion, is a part of a movement, providing education on the one hand to prevent the deterioration of the mental state of these young women. Mental health is in rapid rise across Afghanistan. Suicide rate among girls is incredibly high. And so a movement starting within Afghanistan, slowly building up, connecting women who are able to reach each other, able to help each other. If that starts first within provinces and then within the entire country, they start getting connected. We who are outside start, what can we do? We can support them. We can provide resources. We can amplify their cause.
Making systems.
Exactly, making systems for them. That's what they need. They're ready. They're absolutely ready to start building bit by bit, to the point where we can have a movement, where we could have a march like you had, to get to that point. Whatever change happens has to happen from within Afghanistan. And that support there requires us, requires you, requires our brothers and sisters in South Africa to amplify and support. The way you support Gaza is exemplary. We only hope to one day attain that same level of support from South Africa and our partners here. And I think we're on the right path to building the solidarity, because the visits of Afghan women and civil society actors to South Africa, I'm very happy to say, has increased in the last couple of years. And if this continues to grow, because the first step is knowledge sharing. The very, very first step is knowledge sharing. You tell me things I did not know. I'm telling you things you didn't know. First is knowledge sharing. We're at the beginning, but we're on the right path.
Yeah.
And I think South Africa and its solidarity with Afghan women could potentially change this whole landscape for us and for the women of Afghanistan. It'll take a long time, but I don't think South Africans are scared of time. I get a lot of encouragement. Dr. Jeffrey gets a lot of encouragement when we come here. I always say there's something in the water and the salt in this country.
The atmosphere.
The fight is in the DNA
Yeah.
here. Yeah. We leave so utterly inspired, I can't begin to tell you.
Yeah.
And what I would like to do and what we would like to do is get these voices, how we are connecting right now, to have the youth of South Africa connect with the youth of Afghanistan, and us being just that bridge. You can talk to them yourselves, and they would love to talk to you.
Yeah.
I have 48,000 girls there,
Yeah.
There you go.
ready to speak to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
See?
That is true.
You guys can talk directly.
Yeah.
We just are a bridge, a medium.
Yeah. That's true.
So there's lots to do. And last time I was here, I was with a colleague of mine, Ms. Sharzad Akbar, and she said something that really stuck with me. And I love the way she said it. She's told a group of Afghan civil society actors that we are not entitled to your solidarity. We are merely here to build trust and confidence, so one day we could attain your solidarity. So I want to reiterate that. We are not entitled to your solidarity, but we want the opportunity to continue to build this trust with South Africa in the hopes that one day we can attain that solidarity through and through.
Thank you both for really just driving the point home that as much as there's lots to be done, there's so much strength in numbers. And that is the strength that we'll get over time and as we work and build the trust towards solidarity. And just on my thoughts, I was reviewing Afghanistan's Sustainable Development Report of 2023, and As I look at this diagram and as I was analyzing it, I saw that a lot of the areas falling within the SDGs are flagged as major concern, whether it's SDG 1 on no poverty, due to perhaps the lack of humanitarian aid and how that's put a strain on Afghan families, in the section on SDG 3 on good health and well-being, and how there is a lack of access to healthcare, and how Afghan women can only be seen by women doctors, yet the practice of medicine has been discontinued for women, and such big barriers in terms of life expectancy at birth, in terms of mortality rate and maternal mortality rates. As I also just look at, for example, SDG 4 with regards to quality education and how our young girls, they're not allowed to go to school and get secondary and tertiary education, so also from a younger age, as well as SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, in that, women are denied from working as journalists, working under NGOs, once again working as medicine specialists, doctors. So as I look at all of those categories, all of those areas that are flagged as major concerns, that are flagged as where human rights are being limited, violated, and where access is really, really strained to things that are basic to the average human being. As I look at that, I couldn't help but feel a pang of worry in my chest to say that these statistics were only from 2023. That is 3 years ago. And so much can change in 3 years. And as you have noted down, Ms. Miriam, that just in a couple of months, the Taliban adds so many laws that target women. It saddens me and worries me that things are much worse than the diagrams that I'm actually looking at right now. And so my call for solidarity really mimics what both of you have said, that we have to stop the cancer before it gets worse. We have to really pave a way for change before things go in the direction where the damage is irreversible. And it's important to call for solidarity because every day matters. I remember when we were all sitting at Constitutional Hill about 3-4 days ago, we were listening to Malala speak about how important it is to mobilize with urgency, with zeal, because when the Taliban had denied her education as an 11-year-old, every day mattered for her. And I think the same stands for Afghan women. Every day matters. And I really place this call of solidarity, not just to our world leaders, although their support is so instrumental and so important, but our activists, because there's so many more of us. I place this call of solidarity to people who are also passionate about putting this out there. It's crucial, it's really important for us to realize that there's no struggle that's going to wait behind your procrastination, your excuses, your doubt. There's no struggle that's going to wait, be in the shadow of stagnation, of technicalities, of bureaucratic practices that are taking too long. And so, to the people listening, if you want to speak up and you feel encouraged to give solidarity because of the trust that is given in this conversation and the conversations that you see around the world, it is important to lead with that because every day matters. Now I just want to do a closing. And so I want to offer a word of thanks to We the People South Africa and the Malala Fund for creating the space for us to have these important discussions at Constitutional Hill. I want to first start by thanking these organizations because this is the place where we all meet. And this is also the place that set the foundations for us to bring these conversations to our listeners. And it is so important for the work of gender equality and women's empowerment to live beyond the conference room, to live beyond the round table. these conversations have a place in community spaces as a means to show that our struggles are interconnected and that important conversations don't have to stop. I want to sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, thank the speakers, Ms. Miriam Safi and Dr. Jafari, for taking the time to join me and our listeners on Women's Day. It is indeed a day of celebration, but it is also a day to acknowledge that the struggle continues until women across the world, specifically in Afghanistan, are free. Thank you to Jobs Afghanistan and the Education Bridge Afghanistan, the staffers and teams belonging to these organizations that are led by you two amazing, brilliant women, because these are the organizations that really support women who are fighting oppression. I also want to thank the campaigns that really are associated and accompanied by your delegation. Campaigns such as the Gender Apartheid campaign, for their efforts in mobilizing solidarity for Afghan women and in their efforts in mitigating institutionalized discrimination in Afghanistan and making sure that what's happening on the ground is being understood as gender apartheid. This Women's Day, I want to thank every woman for being beautiful, special, and resilient. A special word of thanks to women around the world who are advocating for gender equality. Women's rights are indeed human rights. And with that, this marks the end of this episode. I'm your host, Mponya Mate, bringing you bold conversations with real solutions. This is the Politics of You and Me, signing out. Thank you.